Hi everyone, it's Tawney. Today I wanted to sit down and talk about 10 products that I think are ugly. And these are somewhat collections with brands. These are collaborations with movies or TV shows or some sort of like pop culture that seems to be popular in the moment. And they're just things that like over time I've slowly not liked. Like some of these things are a little older, some of them are very new. And I just want to put a little disclaimer out there that I'm not specifically like saying that these brands are terrible or that I don't like these brands or that we should hate on these brands or that nothing these brands do are innovative or anything, because just because one collection or one palette doesn't suit me and my liking doesn't mean that somebody else might not like it. And it also doesn't mean that the brand isn't trying to be creative in what they're putting out. Because I feel like sometimes when they put out these collaborations, they're really trying to do something different, something that people are interested in. And it might just be the execution falls flat, or people just don't want it as much as the brand thought they did. So these are the 10 palettes that I want to talk about in today's video. And we will have pictures up in the top for you to see what I am talking about. So first up, we have the Friends and Revolution palette. This is the one with the picture frame as like the shape and the outside, outside image of this palette. And I don't particularly think that this palette in particular is the worst of this collection. I think the whole collection is terrible. But if I had to pick a specific palette, this one was the one that I just didn't really like the most. And I do have to say this is very opinionated. This is just from my perspective. I'm not quite a big fan of this. I think the color story is very difficult to work with. For me, looking at this palette, I wouldn't know what kind of looks to create because some of the shades are very light and dusty looking that I feel like they wouldn't show very well on the eye, and they'd be very hard to work with. Depending on like what color skin tone you have, it could be even more difficult. And like the pinks and reds look okay, but not enough to form like a really nice cohesive look. And I just feel like I would really struggle to find something that like I would want to create. Like, I feel like I would lose a lot of inspiration just looking at this palette. And even not having it, I lose inspiration. Like, there is no way that I would want to buy this palette after looking at these pictures and realizing that I couldn't create any looks. I really like the outer packaging of the palette, and I think it's a good idea. I think Friends is definitely one of those things that, like, every brand can market on it and people would love it. Like, I mean, you have to love Friends in order to like these collaborations and these collections and things. But for the most part, I feel like people would really appreciate these kinds of products being put out. I personally just think this palette looks kind of ugly and would be really difficult for somebody to like be able to make a look out of. There is another Friends and Revolution palette that I feel the same way about, and it's the Lobster palette. This one has a different shape, and it's just like your typical rectangular palette with the little square shadows in it, and there's nothing wrong with that. This palette, again, has a lot of light colored shadows, and I feel like it's really limiting the number of people who can actually use this palette, because I don't feel like a palette that looks like this, I've never seen it in person, I've never like touched it, I've never swatched it, no nothing. For me, just looking at this picture, I feel like someone with medium to deep skin tone would not be able to use this palette because all the shadows would just look like dust and like would look too gray on their skin. And I feel like it kind of takes away the fun of having a Friends collection if you're like limiting the number of people and the type of people who can buy these products from you. You're basically saying we don't want you buying from us because we're not going to include products that can actually work for you. So this is another one that I just feel like the colors aren't good enough to actually like form a decent palette. And you'll find throughout this video that there's several palettes that really go under this category, that the shadows just aren't doing enough for me to make me want to get this palette. Next up is the Urban Decay and Alice Through the Looking Glass palette. This is one a lot of people have talked about throughout the years. I believe this has been out like 4 or 5 years by now. I think they have good intentions with coming out with collaborations like this, specifically Urban Decay. They've tried everything. They've tried Game of Thrones. They've tried Alice Through the Looking Glass. They've tried collaborating with Prince. I think they've had one with Aliyah. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name properly. They've done collaborations with so many people, but I feel like none of them really like hit the mark properly. And this was one that, like, the palette, looking at it, the outer packaging is gorgeous. I love the butterfly. I love the, like, very hypnotic look it gives from the outside of the box. But when you get down to where the shadows are, the reflectiveness of, like, the outside of the shadow just really, like, makes it hard for me to look at this palette. And when you finally, like, even see the shadows and the colors in the palette, I feel like there's not enough to, like, give me a clear idea of what kind of a look to do. There's a lot of greens and blues and oranges, and I just don't feel like those colors blend well enough for me. They don't, like, mesh well. I mean, blue and green does, but, like, the orange just kind of, like, I feel like I'd have a really hard time coming up with a look from this. They kind of just, like, threw a bunch of colors in there and were like, here's our palette, here's Alice through the looking glass. And it's like, maybe we wanted something with a little bit more thought put into it so that way we can actually enjoy the palette and not just buy it because it looks pretty from the outside. You know what I mean? Like, we should get both, not just one or the other. Next up is from Lorac, and this is the Pro. I'm not sure. I'm going to have to put that up there for you guys to see. It's one of the Pro palettes, and this is a palette that falls under that category of a lot of limited deep shadows, a lot of light colored tones, and I feel like this palette has, like, 5, like, I don't even want to call them skin color, skin tone, because that can be very, you know, subjective from person to person, but they're very light, almost like apricot-ish colors, like very pale colors that are almost the exact same thing. Like, there's 5 that look identical. There's a white in there, so that could be a 6th one. There's 2 deeper colors, but there's really nothing to, like, make your look do well. Like, I feel like this palette just is lacking in so much. Like, the color is just stripped from it. And it's like, I don't know what kind of a look they would expect people to do from this because it's so narrow in your options. Like, you just really struggle to come up with, like, a way to do something different that isn't using the same color. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like you just get, like, a brightening, you know, shadow, and that's about all you're left with. I know Lorac has done multiple different palettes. They have good ones, they have bad ones, and I just feel like this one was one that just did not do well. And I feel like, and I hope that they learned from it so they don't do this again, because this is not it. I have 2 products from Morphe. Yeah, I have just 2 products from Morphe. The first one is the Morphe 18A palette, and it is the blue palette. When these first came out, I kind of thought this was a little bit of a joke. This one came out as well as, I believe, a reddish purple one or a reddish pink one and maybe a green one. And they all, like, had potential to have color payoff and have, like, a nice color story. And they just, like, like, they didn't get deep enough. The colors didn't get bright enough. I feel like looking at this palette, I'm left wanting more. I'm left wanting something that can give my look a little bit of, like, a boost. I feel like these colors are okay and they could work fine, but I feel like there's just, like, that little bit missing that just kind of, like, makes me want more. So I wouldn't say this is a terrible palette, but it's definitely not one that, like, really makes me want to use it or even buy it. Like, I feel like it's one I'd walk right past and never even bat an eye at. And I do have to say that Morphe is one of those brands that I walk right past and don't even bat an eye at. I always look to see how bad James Charles' picture looks from how much people have, like, graffitied it at my store, but other than that, that's about all I really pay attention with Morphe at the store. And the other palette that I have to talk about is the Morphe 35C palette. Now, this one I feel like is so pastel that it kind of, like, looks like washed out. There's a couple pink tones that look all the same, that don't really look like they'd be any different on the eye. There's a lot of deeper greens that I just feel like would look very muddy, and it's just not a very pleasing to the eye palette. I feel like you could come up with some good looks. Some of the shimmers might work okay, but to me, I just don't see this as a palette I'd want to use, and I would find a really hard time getting that inspiration to do a look that, like, looks somewhat decent, you know what I mean? Like, I just feel like it's not what we want. Like, I'm just kind of like, if you never did this palette, would anybody really notice? Like, did anybody buy this palette in particular? Because I'm not seeing it. Next up, I am going to smash some people's bubbles, and I do apologize for that. This is just personally, like, my personal opinion, so please do not get upset. This is the Pat McGrath Mothership Subliminal, let's see. I don't know what this is called. I'm going to have to put that in here as well because I'm not totally sure the full name of this. But this is a very cool toned blue themed with like 2 blue shadow palette. From the moment this came out and I really like kind of sort of knew that it was out, it never was something I was interested in. I just thought the darker shadows were a little bit too boring for me. And then the blue looked nice, but it's just like, what am I going to do with the blue? Like for me personally, blue is not a color that like I do well with. I kind of struggle with it as much as I've tried and as much as I've worked with it. It's just not a color that really goes well for me, especially like, you know, an all over look. It's not gonna do too well. So this is just one that I feel like I'm just kind of Like all the other Pat McGrath palettes, I feel like don't look so bad. Some of them look the same. Some of them, you know, are just color stories I'm not interested in. But this one in particular just doesn't seem one that's really like appealing. And I kind of wonder how well this one did in comparison to the other Pat McGrath palettes to see if this one was better or worse, or if it kind of just kept in the middle, like an average sales. Because I like to know if people were interested in this like on the opposite end, whereas I was not at all. You know what I mean? Like I'd like to know the hype around that one. Next up, we have 2 different Tarte palettes. The first one is the Mermaid palette. And I have to say the packaging and the shadow, like the way the shadows are placed in it, the mold, like, you know what I mean? Like the carving with them and whatever. I think it's really nice. It's very cute. It's one of those palettes that like, if I didn't know what to get like a grandkid or a niece or something like that, I would just go get this because it looked cute, not because I knew if the quality was any good or if the brand was like worth buying from. I would just buy it because I'm like, oh, that's cute. My kid would like that. But personally, looking at it, all the shadows kind of mesh into one. They're that very like brown, neutral, sort of leaning a little bit red. And then you have a couple like blue greens at the bottom. But it just really isn't like, I don't know. Like I feel like I would want a little bit more. Like if you're going to do a mermaid palette, make it be very bright, like teals and greens and a little bit of blue and pink and just kind of very oceany themed with a lot of like sand tan colored shadows in there. You know what I mean? Like I feel like this one just wasn't like enough. And I don't want to say that it's like terrible, but it's just not quite there. The next palette is the Tardis Pro palette. And this one, this one, if you watch YouTube, if you're familiar with YouTubers, if you've watched for a while, for the last like 2-3 years, multiple YouTubers have had this on their list of ugly palettes. And they're not wrong. That's kind of like, it kind of made me feel a little bit better about hating it. Whenever I was like thinking about palettes, I'm like, ooh, yeah, this is like a universally hated one. And it's not even that the colors are bad. Like, I feel like they've kind of done like a rainbow palette, which is kind of like picking one of everything that just kind of like makes it a nice palette to have in your, like, in your collection. It's easy to, you know, use. You can like use it with other palettes, but it is so hard to look at. Like, I like the outer packaging. I do have to say I like it. And I like the shadows. But do they mix well together? No. There's no cohesion. They just kind of like butt heads. And it really makes it hard to look at the palette because your eye keeps getting like thrown into like the background image. And maybe that would be okay if the palette was themed in that way, if those were just the colors that you saw. But I feel like the colors in the palette aren't really visible in the packaging, and that really makes it like even worse. Like I just personally think this is like one of the ugliest packaged palettes that we've ever seen come out. Like it just was not, it wasn't it. And I really hope that like other brands have taken note of that because it was not, ooh, it was rough. And then the last palette I want to talk about is a new release, and please don't come for me. I just personally think the first one was better. I know people didn't like the first one, but in my opinion, I actually didn't think it was as terrible as people thought. Maybe it didn't go so well with the movie, but I personally thought it was a decent looking palette. Thought the outer packaging looked really cute. It was really nice. It was kind of like a good change of pace from what they've done in the past. And what we're talking about is the Colourpop Hocus Pocus collection. And the palette I specifically don't like is the new one called the Witching Hour palette. And I personally just don't like it because I feel like the colors are very weird. Maybe this is a color story that works. Maybe there's people out there who can make this color story work. Maybe they can use different colors to make different looks. But for me, I really struggle with this. Going from yellow to orange to purple to green, that is like, that just makes my mind hurt. Like I look at this and I'm like, what am I supposed to do with this? What kind of a look do you want me to do? When you think of Hocus Pocus, you think of dark. you think of black and brown and like very fall colors, and throwing in this bright purple and this bright yellow and all these random greens. It's like, where is this coming from? There's an olive tone green that looks great, but I feel like the teal just really does not go in there, especially if you're thinking about fall colors. So this is just a palette that I feel like they could have just not done. You know, we already have one Hocus Pocus collection. Do you really need a second one? Are you really that hard up for money, Colourpop, that you needed 2 palettes instead of 1 and you had to make the second one terrible? I mean, I don't know. There's somebody back there who just doesn't know what they're doing and nobody's saying anything because maybe they're afraid of them or something. But something needs to be done with all of these brands, not just one specific thing. So those are all the palettes that I have to talk about. I will be doing future videos in this sort of series because I feel like there's plenty of ugly palettes out there for me to discover and find, and I'm sure brands will be coming out with even uglier palettes. So if you have any suggestions, put them in the comment section down below. Put in the comment section as well if you've bought any of these palettes, or if you did not, why you didn't buy them. And I'd love to get a discussion going on like all of these palettes and even ones for future videos. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Ring that notification bell down below so you get notified of when I upload the next video. Thank you guys so much for watching this one, and I will see you then, guys. Bye.